Hello all, I thought I'd offer a quick few comments on the Graham Linehan business. For those who don't know, Graham Linehan is a comedy writer. He's Irish, but he lives in England. He's quite popular. Wrote a show called Father Ted, which was a comedy classic. Anyway, he's been a bit of a liberal type all of his life until a few years ago he questioned some of the trans stuff and found out that you don't do that. And, he got cancelled and the rest of it. And I still think he's a bit of a lib type, broadly speaking. He's just anti the trans stuff and sends it up. He's a comedian. And he's had many run-ins with the whole trans movement before. He's sort of public enemy, well, maybe number 2 behind J.K. Rowling. I think she's the ultimate, what they call it, TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist. So clearly, J.K. Rowling, Graham Linehan don't exactly have the worldview I would have. But I can still say that it's just appalling what's happened to him. So he was in America and flew back to Heathrow Airport, where he was greeted by 5 armed police and taken to a cell and left in the cell, not knowing what he'd done. And it turns out they were arresting him over 3 tweets. Now, I'll link a Substack post that Linehan wrote down below so you can see the tweets he wrote, and they're hardly incendiary. They're mild jokes about trans men, women, I forget which way around it goes. It is just as mild as anything. And I think what I want to comment on here is that obviously this is absolutely outrageous. Obviously it's insane. And obviously it's a sign of how bad things are in Britain. And I do have contacts and friends and acquaintances in different countries who I speak to who do ask me, how bad is it in Britain? And I often say, well, look, it is bad, but it's normally in pockets and there's normally extreme cases. But day to day, it's you could turn away from it if you were just a normie. You wouldn't know anything different. But then there are things like this which just make me look like a lemon, quite frankly, because this is just outrageous. I mean, I suppose on the plus side, I think it is going to wake more people up to how out of control the state is. It is just tyrannical at this point. Now, another thing that I thought was worth adding about this was this reminded me of Callum from the Lotus Eaters. I think he left the Lotus Eaters. But he also got detained, I think, at an airport and questioned for hours about, potential terrorism. I mean, it's just ridiculous why he's being questioned for terrorism and all that. But anyway, they both said something similar, both Linehan and Callum, after this, in that the police themselves weren't that bad. Now, hear me out, because I know you might be saying, hang on a minute, how can you say that? But what I mean is, it seems like the police have to carry these roles out because it's part of their job. And it seems that even they can find it a bit absurd. I think you're obviously going to get the cops who are just going to grunt at you. They're the bureaucratic ones. But Linehan's almost insinuating in his Substack piece that he could almost sense that some of the police could see this was a bit ridiculous. But the orders from the powers that be come down, and they have to carry these things out. Well, they don't have to. And that's a topic that I've covered before. How long will the police put up with this? Remember, they're people too, they're Brits too. I'm sure a lot of them didn't join the force for this. However, there are always going to be those psychotic types who are drawn to authority, and they will stay, obviously, which means it could get even worse with the police as the more reasonable people start to think, what on earth is going on? But anyway, the point is here that, obviously these orders are coming down from the top. Why they're armed police, I mean, if there's reports saying, it's an airport, they have to carry guns. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've seen cops walking around before in airports who aren't armed. I mean, you're always going to have armed cops there, but, you're going to arrest him. Do you really need armed police? Well, you don't, but the point is they're trying to frighten him and they're trying to frighten you. And that's my point with all this. What's really going on with this speech stuff and this censorship, as I've said on the channel recently, the liberal system has ran out of avenues to go down. It's tried the propaganda now for 20, 30 years. They can't keep hammering you with how wonderful, all of the liberal project is. Even the libs themselves, like Graham Linehan, are questioning it, and finding out how brutal it is when you question it. So now they're going to have to start censoring speech, and they're going to have to start scaring people into silence effectively. And I think that's what's coming. And it's already here, really. And I think this is an example of this. Now, I've heard Keir Starmer's come out and said, oh, it's ridiculous. The Met, if you don't know, the London Police, should focus on more important matters, real crimes. Yeah, we're not buying that, Keir. Just like we're not buying that you have a British flag at home or an England flag at home. Of course you don't. You're just saying that to take the sting out of the protests, and try and lessen the chasm between you and the public. But everybody knows you don't have a Britain flag at home, and everybody knows you're overseeing a system, or at least part of a system, which engages in this absolute madness. So I think it's a bit too little too late for the Labour Party types to be saying this is ridiculous. You set this train in motion. You're in charge. You should stop this tomorrow, and you can, but they won't. Of course they won't. And in a sense they can't, because they're deadlocked now by all of these warring factions that have got completely out of control. And because they're obsessed with this inclusion and progressivism, all of their DEI targets come down to, well, how many bigots did you arrest this year? Not enough. We need more. Well, we've only got tweets. Well, that's enough. Arrest them for tweets. That's where we're at, because they have to pump the numbers up. But like I say, I think my key takeaway from this is this forms part of a broader theme that we're seeing develop in the UK at the moment. And I think it's designed to shut you up. Because again, people have reached out to me that have got YouTube channels, and I've spoken to others who've got YouTube channels. And the line it tends to be the same. I was chatting about it with a friend yesterday. Nobody quite knows where the line is of what's sayable and what's not. Obviously, you're not going to incite violence, but you wouldn't do that anyway. Well, most of us wouldn't do that anyway. And further to that, you're not going to be needlessly nasty or cruel to someone. Again, well, there's always one that will be, but most people aren't going to be. And you'd think that would be enough, but then it turns out it's not, And this is the point. They want it to be vague, so you never quite know. And then you're better off just not saying anything. And of course, that's where we're headed. Don't say anything, unless it's basically in line with the liberal regime or mildly critical. And this is the problem, and I think this is why people do have to speak. And when I say speak, I don't mean violence. I don't mean saying horrible things. That's not what I'm talking to. I'm saying you have to speak out against the system because it's out of control. This is madness what they're doing. Arresting a comedy writer who's been on things like Joe Rogan. You can see the guy, like he's pretty mellow guy. He's a lefty liberal lovey type, really. He's just anti the trans madness. That's it. But even he needs the armed police. And I think, again, this is like I say, I'm going on holiday myself soon. And, do you half expect to be pulled over? Of course you do. I think anybody these days, even if you don't have a YouTube channel, even if you've just got a Twitter account with a few hundred followers, say something the state doesn't like, you never quite know. And again, it's not that they actually so much arrest people, it's the threat. That's the threat. That's what really does people in. It's the anticipation, the fear, the atmosphere. And that's what they're really creating here. Of course, I don't buy what Keir Starmer's saying for 1 second. If he could stop it, he would, and he'd come down hard on it. And anybody with any sense should. But of course, he's not going to. Anyway, sign of the times. Do let me know what you think down below. Do consider subscribing to the channel if you're new.